Have you ever stopped to think about why our education system is the way it is? I mean, the way we're all taught to think. What if I told you it wasn't some kind of accident? That maybe, just maybe, it was the result of a deliberate, strategic plan to completely replace one view of humanity with another. Today, we're going to trace the hidden history of that exact idea.
Right. Let's just let that sink in for a second. It was strategic. That one sentence is pretty much the explosive premise of a deep-dive forensic reconstruction by an education researcher named Christine Jones. Her argument? The shift in how we see ourselves wasn't some slow natural evolution. No, it was a targeted replacement.
And this is Kristen Jones. With over 2 decades in the trenches as a teacher and researcher, she makes a really compelling case that our fundamental view of humanity, as a rational moral being, was strategically swapped out for something else entirely. So we're going to follow the breadcrumbs and trace exactly how she says this all went down.
Okay, so to really get your head around a replacement, you first have to understand what was there before, right? What was the original operating system for the Western mind, so to speak?
Well, that original blueprint was a philosophy called common sense realism. This was championed by some brilliant Scottish thinkers like Thomas Reid and James Beattie. And look, this wasn't just some dusty old academic theory. For a long time, it was the metaphysical backbone of university education.
And this vision of humanity is, well, it's incredibly powerful. It basically says that we are rational moral agents, that we come equipped with these amazing tools like reason and conscience, and that we're perfectly capable of knowing and navigating a real, objective, truthful reality.
But this whole framework, this deeply rooted understanding of who we are, it was about to be turned completely on its head. And the revolution didn't start with an army. It started with one single pivotal figure.
Enter Alexander Bain. Now, the crazy irony here is that Bain was educated in the exact common sense tradition he would later tear down. He learned its language, he understood its structure, and then he just rejected its entire foundation.
This chart just illustrates the core of the argument perfectly. Bain pulled off what you could call a great inversion. He kept some of the old words, but he completely flipped the hierarchy. The rational moral agent got replaced by the conditioned organism. The study of ultimate reality, suddenly obsolete. And the new science of psychology, well, that became king. So this begs a huge question. Why? Why did this happen? And maybe even more importantly, how did one guy's philosophical U-turn manage to overwrite centuries of established thought?
Well, according to the source material, the motive was pretty clear. Bain and his circle, which included people like John Stuart Mill, wanted a new model of humanity. They wanted one that was, well, more controllable, more moldable, and just better suited for big centralized administration and social engineering. See, a human with an innate moral compass is kind of hard to manage, but a human who's just a product of conditioning, much, much easier.
And the method? Well, it wasn't a big public debate. It was a quiet, strategic, administrative takeover. By getting a lock on the key university chairs in logic and rhetoric for almost half a century, Bain and his successors basically controlled the intellectual programming for future generations of teachers, leaders, and administrators. Common sense realism wasn't really defeated, it was just edited out of the curriculum. Now, this quiet little curriculum change in a Scottish university didn't just stay in Scotland. Oh no. Like a piece of code, it was ready to be copied and installed everywhere else, and it would end up having massive global consequences.
This timeline is pretty astonishing when you look at it. You can literally trace the journey of Bain's idea, this idea of man as a conditioned organism, from a professor to his student, William Davidson, who then taught another student, young Changji, who then takes these very ideas back to China with the specific goal of training teachers.
So let's just be really clear about what happened here. This specific intellectual DNA, born in a university in Aberdeen, Scotland, became a key formative influence on young Changji's most famous student, Mao Zedong. This philosophy became foundational for a political system built on the very, very premise of mass social engineering.
So, what's the end result of all this? This metaphysical replacement. What does a world built on Bain's model instead of Reid's actually look like?
First up, the whole focus of education shifts. The goal isn't about understanding truth or reality anymore. It's about mastering a process, a technique, a methodology.
Second, the very purpose of education changes. It becomes less about forming a virtuous character, a moral soul, and a whole lot more about training a predictable behavioral response. And finally, the actual subject of study gets swapped out. Those big, grand questions of moral philosophy, like what is good, what is true, they get pushed aside for a new kind of psychology that's all about creating a more manageable mind.
And that brings us to Jones's conclusion. This wasn't just some abstract philosophical debate in an ivory tower. No, this was the installation of a new operating system for society, an architecture designed from the ground up for large-scale administration, technocratic governance, and managing populations.
And that really leaves us with a final and pretty provocative thought. If the very software we use to understand ourselves, our morality, our purpose, everything, was deliberately rewritten almost 200 years ago, how much of our modern world, our schools, our governments, our workplaces, is still running on that very same code today?